Have you ever looked at someone and felt like you were about to make the biggest mistake of your life? They thought everything was fine until the last twist of fate. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind of day where the sun seems to have no end. The hot wind whipped Marcio and Larissa's faces as they sped down the deserted road on their motorcycle. A young couple, united by love, freedom, and speed. They were on their way to a new destination, a place to escape the mundane and lose themselves in each other. But at that gas station, something was about to change their lives forever. Marcio and Larissa weren't going anywhere in particular. Destiny was just an idea, something behind the curve, another piece of road in front of their eyes. For them, the world had no borders. It was freedom that mattered, the feeling of the wind on their faces, and the certainty that life could be lived in any way they wanted. There was something irreverent about the way they dressed and the choice of motorcycle they rode. For Marcio, it was all about the adrenaline. He always had this need to feel faster, more daring than the others. When he got on the bike, it wasn't just to get from one place to another. It was to be the center of attention, to be the one who caught all the eyes. Larissa, on the other hand, loved the feeling of freedom the bike gave her, but she also knew there was something else. She felt the weight of the road, as if every kilometer she traveled was a lesson she would one day need to heed. As they crossed the road, Marcio felt invincible. He liked the look in people's eyes, the way people moved away when he accelerated. The roar of the engine, the rumble of the power chains, it all fed his ego in a way he couldn't explain. The bike was a reflection of who he was, defiant, irreverent, audacious. He knew that what he was doing wasn't necessarily safe, but who cared about safety when life was asking to be lived so intensely? Marcio was convinced that the road, and everything it offered, wasn't about limits. It was about overcoming them. Larissa, however, felt differently. She was still enchanted by the freedom of the motorcycle, but she knew that, as addictive as the adrenaline was, she couldn't forget the price of recklessness. She sometimes wondered why they took such risks. She knew that the bike was an extension of who they were, but she also knew that, deep down, life wasn't just a race. But she loved Marcio. She loved the way he made her feel alive, the way he always pushed the limits. And so she let herself go, believing that somehow their life together would be a great adventure. Even though, deep down, she knew that some adventures have consequences that no one expects. When they stopped at the gas station to fill up, the scene was quiet, typical of a late afternoon. The heat still hung in the air, but the road seemed quiet, as if it were waiting for something. They parked the bike and Marcio walked away to pay, cracking a joke here and there about how quickly he could have filled up if he'd been at home. Larissa stayed behind, watching the gas station more calmly. The sun was setting, and the shadows were beginning to grow, but something about the scene wasn't right. The presence of a man on the side of a motorcycle, far away, seemed to have something more to it. He didn't look like just anyone or an ordinary traveler. His eyes were intense, as if he had lived a lifetime full of memories that no one could understand. She tried to ignore him for a moment, but there was something unsettling about him. His white hair, firm posture, and worn leather jacket were imposing, but his real strength lay in his eyes, which seemed to watch their every move, as if he already knew what was about to happen. Marcio was more concerned with the gas station and his own reflection in the glass, adjusting his hair as if the wind wasn't enough to mess it up. He didn't notice what Larissa felt immediately. He simply didn't care. The veteran was just another figure on the set. Marcio's focus was on the future. How could he speed up even more? How could he overcome the road? He couldn't see beyond his own nose, let alone the lessons the world was trying to offer. But Larissa felt that this man had something to say, something important. He seemed to carry on his shoulders not only the weight of a life lived, but also a wisdom that he was willing to share. When the veteran approached, she froze for a moment, expecting his words to come with the softness of experience. But what he said, sharp and direct, was not soft. "Don't you think you're going too fast?" he asked. His voice was not one of accusation, but of realization, as if he knew exactly what was at stake. Marcio turned to him with a smile, but there was something in the veteran's gaze that challenged him. He replied dismissively, "Careful there, sir. I think you're trying to give me a motorcycle lesson now, aren't you?" He looked at Larissa and laughed, as if to justify his posturing and ignorance. But Larissa, with her eyes on the veteran, felt a growing tension. She wanted to understand more, but she knew that Marcio wasn't willing to listen. "I've only seen what happens when you don't respect the road or life. I'm no hero, but I've learned over time that the hardest lessons are the ones you never expect." Her voice was low, but it carried an immense weight. Larissa wanted more. She wanted to listen, to understand why he was saying that. But Marcio, impatient, turned his back and started walking towards the bike. The pain in the veteran's words echoed, but Marcio didn't listen. He had already decided that nothing would be able to stop him. Who was he to give me a life lesson? Thought Marcio, his hand already on the bike key, ready to leave. The veteran looked at them one last time and said, in a more serious tone, "The road teaches, but the ego blinds. You'll find out too late." At that moment, the truth seemed distant, something Marcio would never have imagined. He didn't know it, but he was about to cross a line that he could no longer go back to. He didn't know that, at that moment, fate was beginning to write its own story. Marcio's motorcycle accelerated hard, like a lion unleashing the roar of freedom. The sound of the engine filled the emptiness of the afternoon, echoing across the open road in front of him. Larissa, beside him, felt the breeze cutting across her face as the road stretched ahead endless. But inside, something in her was beginning to stir. She looked at Marcio, who now seemed completely absorbed in the sensation of speed, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Every time he turned the throttle, she felt the weight of those words from the veteran in her chest. But she knew there was no room to question them. They were living their lives on the edge of freedom, where the past no longer had any power and the future seemed distant, on a horizon of asphalt and wind. But the truth, like a distant echo, could not be ignored. The veteran had spoken with a wisdom that seemed to come from something deep, an experience that transcended any words spoken at that moment. The road teaches, but the ego blinds. Marcio, immersed in his own search for freedom, didn't realize that the truth was lurking there. Larissa, however, felt the weight of those words creeping up on her, almost like a shadow she couldn't shake off. The road in front of them seemed endless, but no matter how fast she went, she knew there was something there that they couldn't leave behind. The wind was strong now, cutting through her skin with the same intensity as the doubt Larissa felt. She tried to focus on the road, but her thoughts couldn't calm down. There was something about Marcio that made her feel alive, but at the same time there was something about his behavior that worried her deeply. He seemed to believe that life was a race, that the faster he went, the more control he would have over everything. But she knew with a visceral feeling that the real control lay in knowing when to slow down. As they drove along the road, a bend ahead came up unexpectedly, tighter than usual. Marcio didn't hesitate, and it was then that Larissa's heart raced. She saw the bend coming, but didn't say anything. She knew he wouldn't hear. Marcio didn't hear anyone else when he was behind the handlebars. The bike glided nimbly along the track, but Larissa felt the pressure on it increase, as if the universe was throwing him a warning he didn't want to see. What was a simple curve for Marcio, for her was a reflection of everything the veteran had said. And once again, she asked herself, how far would it go? Marcio had no idea what was going on in Larissa's head. Nothing else mattered to him. He was the master of the road, and nothing would be able to break the confidence he had in his ability to control it. He felt stronger and stronger, more unshakable, as if he were invincible. His gaze was fixed on the straight line ahead, on the next acceleration point, on the next sensation of speed, without realizing that, in fact, the road was asking for something he didn't yet understand. He didn't see the curve, he didn't see the consequence of his choices. Larissa, on the other hand, saw everything with disconcerting clarity. Her eyes were not on the straight line of the road, but on the way life was unfolding in front of them. She felt fear coming over her, That fear that arises when you realize you're approaching something you can no longer control. She looked at Marcio and, without knowing how, felt a shiver of apprehension, a feeling that they were heading somewhere they couldn't go back to. The veteran had talked about the ego blinding you, but what he hadn't said was that the ego doesn't just blind you. It makes you ignore everything around you until the fall is inevitable. The bend was there, now right in front of them. Marcio, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, didn't notice the intensity of the curve, didn't feel the danger approaching. When he turned the handlebars, the bike didn't respond in the way he had expected. The wind seemed to cut in a different way, and the track no longer seemed so safe. He tried to accelerate even more, believing he could get around as he always had, but reality imposed itself brutally. The bike slid treacherously, and Larissa's vision turned into a blur of fear and disbelief. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the engine, which was now out of control. The dread of losing everything took hold of her as she saw the curve approaching faster than her heart could bear. It was a moment when time seemed to stretch out, as if everything was happening in slow motion. Marcio fought against the destiny that had already been set, but his efforts were futile. Larissa was in a state of paralysis, her mind trying to process the impossibility of what was happening. The bike skidded to a halt, sliding sideways, and then the sound of rubber being crushed against asphalt was the last warning before impact. Larissa's body was thrown to the side, her eyes open, fixed on a sky that now seemed so far away. She saw it all happening, but she couldn't stop it. The moment was cruel, as if the universe had decided not to allow Marcio to live in his illusion of invincibility any longer. When the bike finally came to a halt, with a catastrophic turn, she stood motionless, the weight of reality landing mercilessly on her. The sound of the engine stopping seemed to echo strangely, as if the road was in absolute silence. Larissa was in shock, but she could still feel the throb of her own pain. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. She looked at Marcio, but he was unconscious, lying on the road, as if he were at the very center of his own death. The sky, which had once seemed like an expanse of infinity, now seemed like a cold, distant place, witness to a fatality that neither of them could have foreseen. They were out of control. What the veteran had warned about was now coming true, and there was no turning back. The lesson of the road had been cruel, and perhaps it was there to prove that when the ego becomes bigger than the road, the price paid will always be higher than any of the lessons life can teach. Pain was the first warning, a sharp, deep sensation that ran through Larissa's body like an electric shock. When she opened her eyes, confusion took over her mind. She was lying on the hot asphalt, her vision blurred by the dust that rose up around her, as if the world itself was collapsing in on her. The sound of the wind cutting through the space around her seemed distant, as her body struggled to understand what had happened. Her fingers tingled, but the rest of her body seemed immobilized, as if time had stretched out and frozen at that moment. She tried to move, but the pain was unbearable, a pain she had never known could exist. What had happened to Marcio? She tried to remember. The last image she had was of him, still in charge of the bike, the scene unfolding in slow motion. But now, what was left of that man who was so sure of himself, so unshakable, seemed to be just a shadow, a distant idea that was fading fast. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. She tried to call out to him, but her chest was too tight to make a sound. And then, like a flash of pain, she realized that the sound she was hearing wasn't the sound of the wind. It wasn't the sound of motorcycles. It was the sound of something breaking, something shattered. She turned her head and saw the scene. Marcio's motorcycle was falling slowly, tumbling sideways, the metal of the engine crushed, the front wheel spinning aimlessly, uncontrollably. The machine he had commanded with such authority was now just a deformed mass of metal and plastic, like a wounded animal, thrown to the ground by the blind force of inevitability. Larissa forced herself to swallow the pain that was suffocating her and tried to drag herself to him. Her muscles felt weak, as if she had lost all strength in her body. She tried to stand up, but gravity seemed to be stronger. She couldn't lift her head or move as quickly as she needed to. A sense of urgency came over her, a desperate need to know if Marcio was still alive. She saw him, lying motionless on the asphalt, and the world around her seemed to stop. It was as if time had been interrupted, as if everything around her was disappearing, as if she were alone in an immense void. "Marcio! Marcio!" She shouted, louder now, trying to force her voice to work, to break through the blockage that was suffocating her. But nothing happened. She saw his hand move slowly towards his body, and her vision blurred. The blood didn't seem to be flowing from his body, but his heartbeat still seemed very far away, each one beating faster than the last. She was tense, but what terrified her most was not what she saw. What terrified her was what she knew was about to happen, what she knew that, at some point in her life, she would have to face. She was out of her body now, watching the scene from a distance, like a powerless spectator. She tried to move towards it, but the weight of the scene was too much for her. She felt the ground, she felt the heat, she felt the fear that she wouldn't make it. Marcio's hands were crumpled against the asphalt, but his eyes were closed, as if he had been taken to a place where she couldn't reach him. The feeling of being lost, of being about to lose everything she had ever known, the feeling that he was no longer there, he was still with her. Adrenaline seemed to be rushing everywhere now, creating a kind of vapor, a fog that made everything blurry. But there was something stronger, something that went beyond pain or confusion. Something that Larissa felt with chilling clarity. She had to act. She couldn't wait. She couldn't just sit there, looking at him as if she had already been defeated. He needed her, and she knew it, knew there was no other choice. She didn't know how, but she had to make it happen. She crawled over to where he was, her arms weakening under the pressure of her own pain. Her body was screaming, but she didn't care. She pulled on his body with a strength she didn't know she possessed, lifting him a little, trying to find some response in his eyes. But they were still empty, lifeless. She leaned her forehead against his, feeling his breathing faint, but still there. It was a breath that she wanted to hear, that she needed to hear. A breath that could be the line between life and death. His body was warm, and that made her believe that there was still a chance. It was at that moment that she saw Marcio's eyes slowly opening, almost as if he was coming out of a deep dream. She could see the strands of hair stuck to his forehead, his face pale and scarred from the fall, but still there. And then, in a whisper, he spoke. I knew you would be here." The words came out with difficulty, as if he had struggled to keep them in, but they were there as a reminder that, despite everything, he was still conscious, still alive. It was a moment of ecstasy and fear, a moment of pure vulnerability. It was as if the universe had paused, given Larissa a second to realize how precious and fragile their lives were. The two of them were in the middle of absolute chaos, the road behind them becoming a blurred line, the shadows stretching out as the sun began to set. But there, at that moment, nothing else mattered. What really mattered was that Marcio was there. He had survived. They had survived. And the weight of the lesson was falling on Larissa in a way she could never have imagined. She knew somehow that something inside Marcio had changed forever. He was no longer that man who believed that life was in his hands, who believed that nothing could stop him. He now knew that the road of life was not a straight line, that speed did not make him invincible. Larissa knew that from that moment on, everything would have to be different. The road was still ahead of them, but what awaited them, there was no longer a promise of blind freedom. It was a road of conscious choices, of slowing down, of a deep recognition of what really matters. The ego had been defeated, and what remained now was the true meaning of being alive. Larissa and Marcio were there, on the edge between life and death, but they were no longer the same people. The accident, that brutal fall, had not destroyed them, but transformed them. The pain, fear, and human frailty that they had both experienced so rawly now connected them in a much deeper way than anything life had ever shown them. The road ahead of them, which had once seemed like a simple path of adventure and freedom, now seemed like uncharted territory, where every choice mattered, where every breath carried the weight of life and death. They had learned their lesson in a way that was so brutal, but also so necessary. While Marcio slowly recovered, Larissa, who had always considered herself strong and unshakable, now found herself having to learn the true meaning of resilience. She no longer needed to be the woman who took control of everything, who believed she could face the world alone. She now needed to be the woman who knew when to ask for help, when to accept vulnerability, when to realize that, at certain times, strength comes from humility and the acceptance of her own limitations. Marcio, for his part, could no longer look at the road in the same way. Every kilometer traveled, every curve of the motorcycle, now brought with it the reminder that the human body is fragile and that life, although fleeting, is precious. The blind trust in control and speed was gone, giving way to the awareness that true power lies in knowing where and when to accelerate, but also when to stop and observe. What had once seemed like a journey of unshakable freedom was now a journey of self-knowledge and maturity. They knew that, in order to move forward, they would need to change the way they looked at themselves, at life, and at what really mattered. The true value of their journey was no longer in conquering the next kilometer or facing the next challenge, but in appreciating the beauty of human frailty and the importance of being together in moments of vulnerability. What seemed like the end was actually just the beginning of a new road. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.